Okay, well, I'll start my introduction. I'll keep an eye on the attendees. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending this event as part of the Edward Thomas Literature Festival. My name is Lauren. I'm the Learning Assistant at the Museum. Thank you for attending. Your donations have made this event possible, along with the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which has kindly offered funds for this festival. I'm going to introduce each of our 4 poets that are going to do some readings for us today. So firstly, we have Daljit Nagra. His 4 poetry collections have won multiple prizes and have been shortlisted for many others. He is the inaugural poet in resident for Radio 4 and 4 Extra, and he presents the weekly Poetry Extra show. Next on our list is Yvonne Riddick, thank you very much. She is the AHRC Leadership Fellow, and her poetry and articles appear in The Guardian and the Time Literacy Supplement. Next is Matthew Hollis. Groundwater, where one of his works was shortlisted for multiple awards, including the Whitbread Prize for Poetry. He is the author of Now All Roads Lead to France, The Last Years of Edward Thomas, a book which won the Costa Biography Award and was the Sunday Times Biography of the Year. And last but not least is Zaffar Kunial. He is the author of Us, which was published by Faber and Faber in 2018, and which was shortlisted for the Costa Poetry Prize and the T.S. Eliot Prize. He is currently the Douglas Castor Fellow in Poetry at Leeds University. So we've got quite a lineup. So now, without further ado, I will pass you over to our first speaker, Daljit, and then if the rest of us can mute and turn off our cameras, then all eyes can be on Daljit. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Lauren. Lovely to be here. I noticed in the publicity this is supposed to be a relaxed reading. Oh, everyone's disappeared. How freaky. So in that relaxed spirit, I thought I'd just sort of ramble on a little bit for a while. I thought I'd start with a poem by Derek Mann, who passed away, I think yesterday, as was announced in the paper. So, I mean, a great fan of his work, and I'm sure Edward Thomas would have loved his work if he were around. So I'm just going to read Leaves by Derek Mann from his collected. Leaves. The prisoners of infinite choice have built their house in a field below the wood and are at peace. It is autumn, and dead leaves on their way to the river scratch like birds at the windows or tick on the road. Somewhere there is an afterlife of dead leaves, a stadium filled with an infinite rustling and sighing. Somewhere in the heaven of lost futures, the lives we might have led have found their own fulfillment. Okay, very moving, powerful poem. I'm sure Derek Mann's name will live just as long or longer than Edward Thomas. I'm going to something positive instead. My daughter's brought out a puppy. We bought a puppy today we went to Surrey. They named him just a few minutes ago.
Jago.
This is my daughter Hannah, and this is Jago. He's 9 weeks old.
8 weeks.
Okay, 8 weeks. So got a bleak poem, but life in our house. We have a new baby in the house. Thank you, Hannah. Will you shut the door on your way out? Just in case he starts barking too loud at the thought of us. Anyway, sorry, that was our puppy. And I guess one about Edward Thomas, I didn't really like his work for a long time. And partly I think I started thinking of him a little bit like, Ian, it's a strange comparison, Ian Duncan Smith, when he was leader of the Tory party, you may remember. He was this self-styled quiet man of English politics, and every time he got up in Parliament to speak in the House of Commons, his opponents would start going shh, shh, and in a sense that quiet was sort of satirical, but also reminded me a bit of Edward Thomas' work. I couldn't hear that silence, and I couldn't hear the work. And then I started realising that silence, that the opposition silence in Parliament is quite powerful. And I can imagine Edward Thomas going to these places that he does, and he goes, shh, and listens to the secret inner workings of those places. And he's constantly creating this shh. And I think partly he does that with the language, where there seems to be a kind of contest within the work, an attempt to self-erasure almost, where he's trying to remove the floweriness, the ornateness of language, so he can hear, and his own poetry can create that lyric feeling of the place he's describing. So I've started to come to appreciate that work, or that style in his work. And I guess I'd be particularly keen to look at someone like Edward Thomas, because in a sense I think of him as representing the central tones of Englishness. If I think of the English voice in England, it's people like Edward Thomas or poems like Addlestrop that really represent that. And I see myself as sort of having a tendency on the English language rather than occupancy. And I see myself sort of being at the fringe. I want to kind of have a hybrid voice, which is truer to my sensibility of my kind of Indian background. So with that in mind, I thought I'd read a little extract of a piece I've been writing during lockdown. It's basically a whole book's worth a poem. And it's really about sort of a little background, and I'll read a few minutes of it. But around the 1820s in India, the British created this class of administrators who ran the Raj. They were the Babus, and these Babu Indians were supremely educated. You know, they knew the Roman poets, they knew Shakespeare, Milton, big chunks off by heart. But it wasn't a living language for them. English wasn't sort of something they spoke. So when they did speak it, when they did write it, they were using kind of the contemporary language along with archaic diction. It's all kind of mixed up, and they were getting syntax slightly differently to the administrative English, partly because I guess they were being true to themselves. So my long poem is about the validity of Babu English. Should it exist now, and how can Babu English inspire English? In India, or generally for people like myself. And also then I was thinking partly of Coolie English, which is the kind of servant class, much more of an oral English. And then in this book, I'll bring a Bangra man who talks about Punglish, which is probably a hybrid of somewhere between this highfalutin literary Babu and the Coolie. And the premise for this poem is a poem by Nissim Ezekiel, the Indian poet who wrote in English in the 1970s. He wrote this poem to Miss Pushpa T.S., where she's going abroad, she's not coming back. And he wrote it in a kind of Babu English. And it was very controversial in India. It remains controversial to this day. People felt he was mocking the way Indians spoke. So in my poem, Nissim Ezekiel has offended Miss Pushpa T.S., and the poetry group that meet every month are meeting in this hill station in India. And it's like this room is almost like an MC Escher kind of sketch. It's kind of they seem to be sitting around a table, but they're in all dimensions. And they're going to talk about whether Babu should exist or not, and whether Mr. Nissim Ezekiel needs to apologise to Miss Pushpa T.S. and say, sorry, I wrote in Babu, or defend Babu. Okay. With that in mind, I'm going to open up my screen for you. Hopefully you can. So what I'll do is I'll read just a few extracts for a few minutes. So this is the title for it, Indian. I hope you like that title. Okay, it's all work in progress. This is the alternative title. I'll read that as well. I don't think this will ever be the title. On Mr. Nissim Ezekiel's poem wishing Miss Pushpa T.S. a happy departure foreign. However, Grapevine Know-How is saying Miss Pushpa T.S. is adopting umbrage, apropos and vis-a-vis that affectionate dithyram. Okay, so I'll move on. I'm going to read. So also the problem with the poem is it thinks it's a film, and all the way through different people come in, it functions as a film. So this is how it actually starts. Director, centre stage, say to camera operator, pulley the curtain astride, this talkie is operative. Poetry committee is ultimately being seated. This is the monthly poetry group. Camera operator to director, our shots are hot on dashing Mr. Vishnudas Desani. He's the chair of the committee. Staring out he is from this village of Jarsolvi, with imperial moustache on yellow worsted blazer. Lo, our mensch, our swami. Tasty as ghee, his tamba. Director add. Focus on his teeth, they are seaside bright. Despiting air in India is interjected with grit. Camera operator. How he dandle words from poem by Nissim. Director. He seldom mumble to self, occasion is feeling solemn. Barbre, a dying is there? Are we gathered for sermon? Mr. Vishnudas Dasani is seen mumbling lines from bona fide poem. From Goodbye Party for Miss Pushpa T.S. by Nissim Ezekiel. Friends, our dear sister is departing for foreign in 2-3 days, and we are meeting today to wish her bon voyage. Whenever I asked her to do anything, she was saying, "Just now only, I will do it." That is showing good spirit. I am always appreciating the good spirit. So that's an extract from the poem. So now we take off. Mr. Vishnudas Dasani lowers the book, checks the poetry committee. They are always in goofy mirth. Mr. Vishnudas Dasani waxes, puffs to orate. Hail, all committee, muses, etc. Council must pontificate on the oracle rearing a conflict to verse in pure English, in true speech, or an idiom. Let us bear our judgment of nabobs from these myriad flaws. No Arthurian table this month. Our multitude seating is theatre-like. I feel dunked in a pit, while you seem balconied, boxed. I say, we are helicopterized, swaying in a wooded sector of dimensions. These 5 dimensions, whose view is Everest to ant perspective in the same gamut of a look-round. I say, O peak of Ind, winking nether at the docked Chandrayaan, our rocket that slaked the lunar waters, while NASA looked on wilted. O Vale, do your orphaned cottages weep panegyrics to their siblings in Wessex, Ambleside? Yonder, what pokes from those groves? A Victorian bookstore, with folios hot off and pressed by Yvonne Kunial. Also Diaz, heaped rich, richer than the shelves at Hay. Hail, our destinies are fissured. Mine soul follows Nissim, my nut flows aft H. McNish. Director whispered to camera operator, are his fixed syllables in a bifurcated rhyme? Middle rhyme bent above, below, at the same time for an AABB tercet chime. Camera operator, fit triple rhymes only I hear. He is famed, our great vowel shifter, our vowel bybender. Camera returned to Mr. Vishnudas Dasani, who has been vaping up a brain of steam. Ho, parishioners, well zoomed. Some of us rose from over the hill, others propelled from motherland. Our poor mother, an EU widow in whites. How we gather here unmoored, aghast to discover a tuk-tuk will by and by park outside to collect Nissim. He will fly for Miss Pushpa. She is not amused, our parent of poetic letter, in 1970s, au revoired her with Babu. Oh, Babu, our wedding cake of Englishes, our juggernaut of marzipan, by which legions of us across the caste pipe our conduct. Cake and marriage, you hear? Yes, since the time the Raj made Romeo with our wallet. Do we but mimic Her Majesty, or do we potpourri? We have been comic buffoons from Orwell to Seth, from Rushdie to Qureshi, from Carry On Team to... yes, Mrs. Taj, I am off-piste. Pardon me. I have jumped from the horse of galloping grist, seating myself on the escalating horse of digress. Yet our hurdling want is we brainstorm unpickled advice for Mr. Nissim. Should he, nay, and not apologise, or play saddle for Miss Pushpa, so Babu is platformed? If we lock our wrestling limbs on dialectics, acorns of Welton Shong will trigger this very day learned oaks from Nissim in Miss Pushpa T.S. Then watch her invest plantations of thanking. Before we adventure advice, is Nissim at council, here to fly on board our mind-eyes? He may be smiling at us from heaven, our bizarre game of time. In future or past, whom are we? All I can gleam, he may be smiling at us from heaven, our bizarre theme. Director to camera operator. In Easter 2020 we are, having assembled, if I correctly discern, giving counsel to R.I.P. poet toward his R.I.P. stimulus, Camera operator had hands clasped. God bless Mr. Vishnudas Desani. This proved how timeless he's. Mr. Vishnudas Desani has been in quantum flow, some of which is annoyingly missed by director operator Tufro. All I can say, our national tree have limbs bountiful, willy-nilly blooming fetus who are wide-moored, reared tall in coolie or bubble. Does English breed? By our windfall. Director to camera operator. This committee rising in Whoopalong is doolally. Camera operator. They know Mr. Vishnudas Desani is top carrot babu, his own last rum laugh. Who dare mock the panjandrum that mock itself? Even the cameras jiggle. My camera team make giggle. By the way, you liking how all cameras are pink dayglow? My crew uniform is lemon yellow. Director. Indeed. Who is laughed at when laughter make laugh of self? Presently, surely, Mr. Desani will end the exegetical outset. Okay, so he waffles on for a bit longer, then the rest of the poem is about all the committee members coming in and giving their views on Babu or Cooley and whatever, and just various other things happen for many, many more pages. So that's me done. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing Matthew, Yvonne and Zaffar. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Daljit. Well zoomed, I could say. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I think from the outset of this, you're going to see how much the quiet Edward Thomas has influenced me, really. I think he's a wonderful poet of environment and place. He's an extraordinary poet of war, a writer of war, and he was a great walker. I love hiking. I write about hiking. I write about the things I bump into when I'm hiking, from wildlife to other people. I'm going off scrambling at Kinder Scout tomorrow, which should be good fun. I've also written about environmental issues that I encounter on my travels. We've had a dog today. I've got you an animal poem about a ptarmigan to kick off. I can't promise you a real ptarmigan. I can't show you one. But here we go. Ptarmigan. You will see how Thomas has influenced this from the second line. You know that beautiful poem, The Comb by Thomas, that has that wonderful last line, that most ancient Britain of English beasts? You'll hear the echo of that in this poem. Ptarmigan. Even their eyelids are feathered, that most high Arctic of British birds, that cry the clacking of pebbles. Beakless and unclawed, we needed picks, crampons, soft shells, and 4 pine logs crackling in the great Kura. In December, a scouring wind on the Devil's Point sent us scurrying for the Rock of Tailors, named for the 5 caught out in a blizzard. New Year and the burn is in spate. Ladies' mantle blooms and gnats swither from hollows between boulders. But these Ice Age refugees require weather from beyond the north wind, a snow cloak to outfox the eagles. There, they huddle in a melting drift. Step too close and they burst into flight, a snowstorm towards the Angel's Peak. In many ways, that is a climate change poem. A lot of people are writing about climate change at the moment. It is a crucial issue. We've just had the Laurel Prize for Environmental Poetry awarded. I'm interested in what causes climate change, and one of the sources of that is oil. I have a weird story of personal contact with oil beyond, whatever synthetic stuff is in my outfit today. My dad was a petroleum engineer. He transported my family up to Aberdeen and he worked on the offshore rigs. He then took us all off to Kuwait City. So there's conflict in this poem, major conflict. It deals with the First Gulf War. And Thomas is one of our writers about war, and I wanted to look at some of those issues that are rather difficult, actually. So this is called In Oils. Between fjords and the firth, the rig whirred from its crown block to the pit of its possum belly. My father left at dawn to work the offshore fields. He grafted with roughnecks and a crude talking tool pusher. Their toil lit the flare stack, sparked fuses, stoked motors. Farther north, the trickle and tick of ice flows. That year's gales uprooted dunes, hurled gulls along Union Street. The derrick braced its anchors, strained against the storm surge. His chair sat empty. The desk paperweight, a drop of Brent crude globed in glass, the tarry slick levelling as I tilted it. I tried to pray for breezes to ferry him home, but all I could invoke were fields of North Sea oil. Magnus, Beatrice, loyal. I was 9 when my father made us leave. He drilled an emirate with straight ruled borders, the heat on the runway like the breath of a foundry. My Narnia books arrived after their voyage along the Suez Canal in the sea freight. Wearing shorts was forbidden, even for men. Mirage City, under the warp shimmer of 50 degrees, sun-beaten metal, light-struck glass, the bombed-out bridge to Bubiyan Islands. At the sandstone ridge on the edge of Iraq, herdsmen turned camels loose to trigger landmines. At school, they preached that oil was fossil light. 1 barrelful did 12 years human work. Dad's friends talked Bonnie Light, Brent Blend, sour heavy crude, measuring days in gallons. Oil was refined, but its temper had a flash point. I'd listen from the landing. They kicked down the door of the neighbour's shop, then bullets started shattering our windows. Khalid and I ran. We saw tanks lumbering down Gulf Street. They stole everything. Air conditioners, cigarettes, then torched the ground floor. My cousin shot at the police station they'd seized. They tore out his eyes. The burning pipeline howled, Sarah said, like a jet engine. Fire trenches and oil lakes under a sky dark at midday, 6 million barrels of light, sweet crude. I watched birds wading in the slick ponds. There was a hoopoe drinking petroleum, an oiled eagle panting for water. Airstrike on the Basra Road, the man clawed at the windscreen, trying to smash free before the petrol tank blew. An American camera blinked at his burnt-out sockets. From Anchorage, Calgary, Houston or Galveston, my father returned, jet-lagged and burning fumes to plant English lavender on Texan time. I'd see him at the sink, scrubbing his hands. "I've fixed the engine." He'd show his palms. I watched him scouring skin that wouldn't come clean. His shirts would smell of earth and gasoline. So I've got a poem that looks at environmental time for you, and also conservation and thanks, and restoring ecosystems. Yeah, I'm a bit of an eco nerd. I love trees, I love planting trees. I have no expert interest in trees. I'm just an enthusiastic conservation volunteer. And they get me thinking quite hard about the future and what things are going to be like, basically. And kind of legacies and future generations. So this one's called Fire Seed. Saplings in neck braces, infant willow, oak, fledging into leaf. Their roots have hit the quarry's midden. You hawthorn that delicate cling of your spines. Little northerners, you'll keep your first winter close in a dark band. But hornbeams will outlive 6 kingdoms and weather 60 governments. A you can remember doomsday. The land's hollowed edge. You trees are the only children I can bear to watch growing tall. I suppose this is another Gulf War poem, really, but it's also a poem about childhood, and a rather weird childhood I had during my spell in Kuwait City. My sister and I loved the garden. As Thomas is an incredible poet of landscape and place, I thought I might try and weave some of that in. It's called Imagines, and it's about butterflies. That garden of émigrés and locals, sacred fig, date palm. I was sent to clip the shockhead orange tree and drop the shears when I saw I'd committed murder, an inchworm, halved. Chubby infant pythons, its 4 siblings cowered under leaves. My sister and I salvaged them, provisioned them with lime twig offcuts, camouflage from sparrows and the boys who dismembered soldier ants in science. 7 years since the swarm of nighthawks burst the sound barrier, each bearing its high explosive clutch, zeroing on Baghdad. Shots imaged the troops, mantis-eyed in gas masks. They shredded leaves to veins for a fortnight, then inverted their skins like the werewolves that stalked my Grimm's tales. Armoured chrysalids folded their flight. North of the border, the local despot unleashed nerve gas trialled on insects. Birds fell to earth from nests, dogs choked on bloody foam, finally people hacked up their lungs. That memory still stung behind the eyelids. When tornadoes howled overhead, their sonic boom detonated the night terrors of my sister. We watched their eclosion, damp wing rags unscrolling like hibiscus petals, the oil sheen shot with lemon. I couldn't say whether their checkered dappling was the likeness of a silk prayer rug or a stained glass icon. 4 checkered swallowtails, flexing symmetrical wings, we watched each dart through the doorway into the flowering season. So there's quite thank you. There's quite an interesting project going on at the moment in Texas and Nevada. The Long Now Foundation is building a 10,000-year clock, and it's designed to help people think about environmental time and longer time scales. And what this makes me think about really is kind of the life of nuclear waste and what the environment is going to be like in the future. It's a little bit of a dark poem. I hope things won't pan out that way in real life, but yeah, I wanted to explore those ideas. Shadow time. Under the mountain, a clock ticks once a year, in a cavern deep as the massif is tall. Start the climb through the desert at dawn. There's no water. You must ascend 2,000 feet. The clock's gears creak. Last time it peeled its stroke, the ice shelf groaned, carved into the sound. The door is steel-rimmed jade. Turn the handle. Step inside. It thuds shut. In earth core darkness, you can make out a mine shaft deep as a cathedral. Above, the faintest blink of light. You must clamber to the summit now, up a spiral staircase through the guts of rock. There's the 1,000-pound counterweight hanging like a stone whale's heart. Not the sort of time that flickers in a wristwatch. This is the span of ice ages, civilizations. Wind it, the strike of cliff-sized bells. The clock knows the mountain under you is moving. A dome of sapphire glass. The dial shows the 1,000-year walk of unfixed stars. This clock can strike the time through nuclear strikes. This clock will tick until the sea arrives. So just to finish for my last poem, I was reading this book about environmental writing for the day job. I'm a literary scholar as well as a poet. And it described a person's carbon footprint as a bit like their uncanny double. I thought, how weird, that's fascinating. I must write something about this. And this is kind of a weird fairy tale about that idea. It's definitely a climate change poem. It's hard, but it's got that kind of rural atmosphere that I find in Thomas as well, which is why I thought I'd select it. In the burning season, she knocked one night as the clock tripped through shortening dark. Brows and eyes cold copies of mine, but her braid was auburn. She read my face, cotched by the stones, stirred the embers. Make yourself at home, she told me, gorging the brazier on my best coal. We were up with the next day to prune my apples. Summer king, beauty of art bath. Hard frost hissed at the heat of her instep. A fingertip tapped on bark. Nude pear trees frosted with blossom. Mayweed and nightshade rioted over the January field. The sky a flashover. To teach me pyrography, she scorched her name 2 letters from mine into the mantle. I bit my yell in 2 when, come on, dare you? She turned the branding iron on my forearm. Joe said he'd flown to meet partners in Frankfurt. The flags and thatch creaked themselves to sleep. I ghost crept to the ensuite and caught her in the bathtub, blowing him a light. So I bolted downstairs, triple-clicked the locks, and gave that pair and the house a gasoline shower. These fingers are still webbed with scars. Joe's bought a flat in West End. My hair has grown back bent. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Daljit and Zaffar, and thank you to you all for sharing some of your Saturday with us. I have a storm going on overhead, so I apologise if there's any dropout. And I also apologise for not having a puppy to pull out of my pocket in a bold attempt to raise audience figures, Daljit. That's superb, and I will have one for my next reading. I am going to begin with a poem by Edward Thomas and finish with one related of my own. Thomas's was published posthumously in his first collection, Poems, by the London firm Selwyn and Blount in 1917, on pages then bought by the New York publisher Henry Holt for his American edition, that you see here, on the persuasion of Robert Frost. Until this moment, the little that Thomas had printed in poetry had then gone under the name of Edward Eastaway, and it remains a shame to this day that the collection to which he gave his real name should have been such a cheap production. Our poem for today is sandwiched. It's cramped between 3 other poems on the same spread, and yet our poem remains one of Thomas's most space-giving works. Thaw. Over the land, freckled with snow half-thawed, the speculating rooks at their nests cawed and saw from elm tops, delicate as flower of grass, what we below could not see, winter pass. Blizzards had battered Harehall Army Camp in Essex that winter of 1915-16. A covering of snow continued on the ground until March, Edward Thomas was cold and dispirited. He had been denied promotion and refused leave, and had spent his 38th birthday in camp because of it. Home lay 80 miles away in Hampshire, but it held ambivalent feelings for him, and he sensed a faltering in his poetry since his mentor, Robert Frost, had returned to America the previous year. Thomas had been writing verse for just 15 months, but already he had produced 2/3 of the poems that he would write. In the bitter conditions of army camp, a despondency that had accompanied his adult life began to take grip on him once more. It was the second week of March 1916 before conditions finally began to improve. "The weather is changing fast," he wrote to Frost. "The snow has melted. The sun is very warm. The rooks in camp trees are nesting. They wake us at 5:30. He had finally been given leave, and on the train to Hampshire, he opened his notebook, and in pencil, he wrote, "Over the land with freckled," and he hesitated. Not with freckled, but freckled with. He tried again. "Over the land, freckled with snow half thawed, the rooks at their nests cawed." But this second line seemed abrupt, and he went back. "The speculating rooks at their nests cawed." Yes, that was it. Speculating. "Seeing from the tall elms delicate as grass," a sudden stumble in the rhythm. He tried again. "And saw from tops of elms delicate as grass." Not perfect, but for now he continued. "What we below could not see. Winter pass." Later, most likely in his study in Hampshire, he wrote out the verse in a neat ink on the facing page of his notebook, revisited the rhythm of the third line, and this time lengthened it markedly. In one final reworking, he made small adjustments of punctuation, but in truth, little had changed from that first draft that he had all but perfected on the train journey between Essex and Hampshire, 10th of March, 1916, going home, as he noted on copy. All that was left was the making of a typescript from which publisher Selwyn and Blount would set their edition. Thomas excelled in the quatrain. He had already composed In Memoriam, Easter 1915, but would soon repeat the form identically in The Cherry Trees. But Thor was an entirely original creation and bore the hallmarks of what by the spring of 1916 had come to distinguish his verse. In its subject matter, it was attentive to the seasons, to the birds, to the elm trees that in themselves mark out Thomas's countryside as being from another era to our own. In its diction, it was radical. Speculating was not a word that a creative writing class today would likely advocate. Its 4 syllables were a risk to any single syllable line, but its animation was pure Thomas. In its form, it was inventive. Draped across a frame of pentameter, it resisted iambs and it extended its third line unnaturally but skillfully in order to decelerate the reader towards its finale. For it was there, in that last line, that the true magic of the poem would take place. There it was that Thomas achieved what he alone among his peers appeared capable of, imagining not what another human being might see, but what an animal. It was a respectful separation of sense and perspective that he had become a master of, and it's part of the reason why today he is regarded as so ecologically advanced. Shortly before Thomas would die in France, he noted in his notebook, "Rooks in tall trees on north side of Arras. They and their nests and the trees black against the soft, clouded sky. I wanted to meet Thomas's poem with a poem of birds. I thought of a piece called The Blackbird of Spitalfields that's published in this month's New Statesman. That is, until my 14-year-old read it and said, "What? That doesn't make sense. It's not even English." And I thought of something from a pamphlet called Leaves that publishes next month with the Hazel Press. That is, until my 6-year-old read it and said, "Daddy, I don't think you should read Leaves. They might find it a little long." So I'm reading instead an unpublished poem that neither of my children have seen called Rooks in Memory of My Mother, which developed out of a field notebook, which was, of course, something that Thomas did all the time. And if you know Thomas's work, you'll know that many of his poems have their foundations in his notebooks. And I'll read just a few lines of the notebook and then the poem. From the notebook: "At dusk, sometime between 5 and 6, 50 or 60 rooks overhead, east to a coppice of trees that I could not make out in the half dark. They made such a noise that I did not hear those approaching in a second larger flock, and looked up by chance at hundreds overhead, perhaps what the blitz might look like. Those two settled on the dark trees, and for 20 minutes there was calm, but then from the west and the south, others came in their thousands. I'd never seen so many birds or heard such chorus, quite untroubled by high winds and cold rain. The first flocks lifted from the black coppice, and the twisted ball of animals turned into the cars before going in. It was utterly mysterious and utterly breathtaking." Rooks. When the mark is lifted from your body, the ghost chased from deep beneath your skin, and we learn, as every living creature must, to heal again. Remember what it was that brought us here, to a marsh in midwinter in a gathering dusk, as the road seeps into shadow. Night comes nearer each night. So we rely on what we absorbed by light. The gradient, the ground to foot, the hollow track. Whatever we know to be out there, out where our sense would swear there is nothing to harm us but our fear. How reckless it seems to let it come in and do nothing to prevent it, not to reach for the car keys or phone, not to be thinking of torchlight, home, but laying down our upper hand and facing into the whelm. Remember then what brought us here under lengthening dark, climbing the lane to the inking oaks as the birds begin to gather. At first, there is barely a happening, a shuffling of cards in the branches, and those Parliament cries reeling in tens from the telephone lines, till down they go into the thickening trees, and for a time, calm, a hare in the harrow field, all else still. And we turn for home, believing it done, unequipped for the scene to come. From south, above the cars, they come in their thousand, more swarm than flock, and oil smoke, lifting the choirs from their branches, others from outfields as though rising through earth, shaking the bigger soil from their backs, until up and over the trees they funnel, 10, 20,000 more. And we crane our necks at the tumbling shoal and can no longer tell if it's up or down that we stare. And there, right there, is the fault. For here is a moment unlike all else, wild at wing, unmatched in every region, when no simile can earn its keep, just reduce or compress to terms we can digest. And still, we fumble for familiarity, recalling the likeness, looking up as a child from a bonfire, watching the ash tufts rise and lit and feather in the night air. Why will the mind make one thing like another, when some marks won't compare, when the ghosts coerce and the cells turn on a scale we cannot answer, acts no God can tidy, that astound and stay with us long after the blackbirds have settled in the forest.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm on. Great, good. I've not done this before, so I'm going to try and read on screen if I can find my. But it's great to hear you all. Oh, now I can see my poem, but I can't see the screen. Sorry about this. Here we go. So, oh, by the way, thank you, Daljit, for mentioning me in the poem. That was great. And I really enjoyed hearing everyone. Really loved all that. I'm going to start with a poem called The Hedge. And yeah, I came across this thing about a week ago. There was an article from a university in Taiwan, and it mentioned new British poets, and it said that I had quite an English voice, and pleasingly it mentioned Edward Thomas, and it mentioned Matthew Hollis as well, and said that talked about being a poet of hedges. And I thought, I don't really write about hedges, but then I realized what kind of hedge they were talking about. It just so happens I have this poem called The Hedge. This country is full of them, England, Britain, its green envelope, hedges, or the unflagging, unflappable ghost of hedges, at the shore of eyesight or running along the curb, the thorny blank verse of it, foliate text. What is behind the same hedge from one day to the next might be from entirely elsewhere. I know the scratches that come from seeking the lost in a hedge, scratches you didn't know were happening, the unexpected denseness, the unexpected release from the dark thicket of light. It was light, I think, that pulled a hedge out of thick air's sleeve, an old hedge, and with it a disappeared wicket, a Springfield street, a church green, a school, a long gone afternoon, perhaps Birmingham, perhaps the whole of unknown England and beyond. I'm going to do something terrible here. I'm just going to plug in my computer just for one horrible moment. Sorry about that. Sorry, it was just about to conk out on me. There you go. And now I'm going to read a poem called Foxglove Country. Sometimes I like to hide in the word, foxgloves, in the middle of foxgloves. The excla is hard to say out of the England of its harbouring word. Alone it becomes a small tangle, a witch's thimble, hard to toll bell, elvish door to a door. Excla, a place with a locked beginning, then a snag, a gla, like the little Englands of my grief, a knotted dark that locks light in glisten, glow, glint, gleam, and Oberon's banks of eglantine, which closes in on the opening of Gulliver, whose shrunken gull says rose in my fatherland. Meanwhile, in the motherland, the exga is almost the thumb of a lost mitten, an impossible interior, deeper than forests and further in, and deeper inland is the gulp, the gulf, the gap, the grip that goes before love. That's called Foxglove Country. And one of the things I like about Edward Thomas is his sense of kind of otherness, as though there's a kind of doubleness to his consciousness or something. When I was young, I used to have this odd sense of otherness, and I wondered whether it's to do with these other landscapes that were within me. And so I tried to write about this. It's called Ireland, England, and it could have been called anything really, but Ireland, England. It's not all of me, and I can't pin the feeling to a map, or only approximately as mist, but some part of me is all for it. At the top of the street, knowing nothing, small in Midlands fog, I felt it, out of place and at home, and would realise far later where or what it was. You know, I love how Thomas is, you know, ancestrally Welsh and yet is seen as very English. And I've written a poem called "A Rose at the Door," and I'm reading it now because of the Old Man poem, where there's a herb at the back door. And the door in this case is the Bronte Parsonage Museum, which is about 6 miles away from my front door. And there's a rose outside the front door there, which is called Emily Bronte, and it's a very newly kind of made rose. And of course, Brontes are seen as very English as well, but their father was Irish. A rose at the door. When my nose hovered close in, the first thing, if first is the right word, was tea. The smell of tea was an afterthought, impossibly, as though a fresh tablecloth had been placed without disturbing dusty ancient books within on the drop-leaf table. After tea, a new word started to form tentatively, the way green wakes up on a rose stem, like the bud of a musk deer's antler pushing through the head. Lemon, perhaps, guava, apricot. Beyond colour on the spectrum, I sense violet, far from the actual off-white pink, whose thumbed pages yellow towards the stamen, the centre. Scent is so primitive, sensed in the reptile brain, unblushingly shy of speech, our earliest pre-verbal stem. Yes, tea, certainly. No, yes. And yet curtains, the way they trap old cloud, or what is dimly beyond them, as the word thirst slips from the wrist of the word first, or the true grips the Sanskrit drew, tree, and there's oak in the old Irish door. There were no curtains in the house of before, but now is a new rose, a gathering folding place. Somewhere over the hill, it's heather, it's weather, petaled within, within, within. Two landscapes grafted together, doorways made one. And I'm going to read a poem called The Groundsman, which is a sonnet with 17 lines. And it kind of, the last 3 lines are kind of run-on lines. And it's in the voice of a retired groundsman, perhaps a cricket groundsman. A groundsman. These days, in spite of my runny hay fever, I love this long grass, a sentence left uncut for years, and floating within and above, the clover cloud world. Daisy, a distant vetch, a foxglove, poppy, a parasol, Queen Anne's lace, a breeze with an old green face, a crow's feather, a dotty cabbage white in a groundless shiver, the alive among the dead in the fine chaos of a day, this fugal sway of height and depth, the charged haze its own kind of light brigade. I'm not learned, but heard a dead poet called Vetch a fetch. School was enclosed, a game of squares and lines, old griefs not mine. Then, head down, ear to each pitch, I bowed to a checkered green baize, days, nights, all cut, ruled, rolled into one, making a singular pattern, that great big brocade, like a life, however long, is wider than its page. Grounds, I believed, the world would run on. And I'll end with a poem called The Wind in the Willows. This is my Wind in the Willows book. And of course, this was published in 1908, so it's contemporary with Edward Thomas, or the pre-poet Edward Thomas. But I think he was always a poet. And it's partly about the willow tree, and it's partly about poetry. The Wind in the Willows. Although the book was another country to me, I knew the title, and the title stuck. I always liked the title, the species too. I'd say if asked, it was my favourite kind of tree, though it was never with one certain tree in mind. There was a garden, I vaguely remember, the way the leaves curtained, like shadows, a lit cave, a fringe, not yours, you could look through, and the supple wood made cricket bats, which was a part of the little I also knew. Maybe it was all a little to do with letters too, two tongueless trees of L, the uncrowing big W's in The Wind in the Willows. Maybe it was all oral in the echoed in, wind in, the these, the three billowy was. Maybe the leaf-fringed mystery between the two. And speaking of poetry, I had this initiating thought that the flax-smelling willow in the first cricket bat I was gifted contained the wind, held old power still, light enough, slight arms could lift it, wind in willow, this percussive wood a gathered strength, a mutual bind. Though I was far from writing, or this book, that sense, I suppose, in spirit, was poetry, and early. The very last thing poetry is a poem. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Sorry about my mishaps.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was fantastic. I have to be honest, I hadn't heard any of your work before, but yeah, that was amazing. I hope everyone else enjoyed it. We're not going to have any Q&As. I was going to ask you about how Edward Thomas had influenced your work, but I think each of you actually brought up a bit about Edward Thomas. So I think what I'll ask instead, a nice sort of hopefully short question and answer, is if you do have a favourite Edward Thomas poem, which one is it? Mine is 4.
Adlestrop for me, maybe a bit obvious.
Mine's the Coombe.
It's a bit like choosing between your children, isn't it? I could say, but I suppose I love the precision that he can find within something like Thor. But of course, he was a great narrative poet. As the Teams Heard Brass is one of the most astonishing poems of the war. It really is quite remarkable, I think.
I love loads. I love one called The Word. I love the Coombe as well. I love how Coombe is like an old Celtic word or Brittonic word. And he has a brock in it, which is one of the few Celtic words. I love it. I love his sensitivity to language. I love it.
I think mine might probably be Fast Beat My Heart, because it does every time I go up that hill. Yeah, I'd say that.
Well, thank you so much, everyone.